We're in Tokyo at Rikkyo University with Kayo
Matsushita.
Matsushita. And the first name is?
Kayo.
Kayo. Good. Okay, so Kayo, what do you do?
I teach translation and interpreting studies at Rikkyo University, both at the undergrad level and the graduate school level.
Okay, but you also do research.
I do research as well, and I specialize in news translation because I used to be a journalist.
Oh, right.
But at the same time, I switched careers and became a conference interpreter. I've been doing this for over a decade now, and so I do research on interpreting and technology nowadays.
And are you still working as a conference interpreter?
I am.
Okay, dividing both.
Yes.
All right. Go back to your mid-20s. What were you doing back then?
Yes, that's an interesting question because right after I graduated from Sophia University, which is a university in Tokyo, where I majored in journalism, I became a newspaper reporter for one of the daily newspapers in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And so back then, it was customary that all the new hires will be sent to local prefectures within Japan. So initially I was sent to Kagoshima, which is the southernmost prefecture apart from Okinawa. So it's kind of next to Okinawa, divided by the ocean. And I spent 3 years there. And then I moved to another prefecture called the Yamaguchi prefecture, also on the west side of Japan, at which point I was something like 25. And I thought about my career. And I always wanted to be a foreign correspondent. I wanted to make use of my background, international background, which comes from Britain. Well, I spent my childhood in Britain. And that's where I learned how to speak English, and therefore,
So you weren't using your languages at all?
Almost like 0.5%. So the thing is, and I was constantly writing only in Japanese, which helped improve my Japanese, writing skills, but it wasn't enough for me. So I decided to take a year off from work and study at graduate school of journalism at Columbia University in the city of New York. They always tell us to say.
So hold on, you're a working journalist,
yes,
and then you go and study journalism.
Yes,
all
exactly.
Right. Okay.
I studied journalism in for my bachelor's degree, but I also decided to do one for my master's degree. Mm-hmm. So it was a 1-year program, but back then it was kind of called the boot camp because it runs from like 9 a.m. to 11 p.m. It was just, it's a 10-month program, but it was a very dense program with more than 300 American students, aspiring journalists, and only 30 or so international students. Mm-hmm. And so there and that was when 9/11 happened.
Yes,
I went to New York in July of 2011. And then 2 months later, 9/11 happened.
Well, welcome to you.
I know. Yes. But the thing is, I shouldn't say positive, but one meaningful experience that I had was covering the aftermath of 9/11. But the downside was that we really couldn't do anything but 9/11 back then.
So you became a foreign correspondent?
Well, after I came back to Japan, and after 5 years or so, I became a foreign correspondent and then was sent to New York again to cover the United Nations.
So how do you get to translation?
So,
that was your...
Yeah, that
aspiration.
Was I still remember one of my supervisors at Columbia, what he wrote in my final paper. He wrote that, you were born to be a reporter, and a very good one, in fact.
Okay.
Coming from the top graduate school in journalism in the US. So what I wanted to say was that although I liked being a journalist, I knew that the industry was going through very turmoil years or maybe decades because of the Lehman shock, basically, and all the ad revenues going down, and major newspapers in in the United States were laying people off by hundreds. So I was a print journalist, meaning I was a newspaper reporter. I didn't see much future in my career. I was already in my mid-30s back then, and I thought that this is not going to last. The journalism as we liked it will disappear. So after coming back to Japan, well, even before coming back to Japan, that was in 2010, I decided that I would rather go to a think tank than going back as a frontline journalist. And my company said yes. So there was an institute within the company that I worked for called the School of Journalism, basically, or Journalism Institute. And they were providing paid lectures at universities, and they were publishing their own journals.
Mm.
So initially, I started going out and teach journalism and write articles regarding journalism studies, basically. So that kind of led me into this world, academia, because I had some connections, but I wasn't sure if I really wanted to major in journalism studies. I mean, I've been doing that until my master's, but I knew that I needed a PhD. So then I started looking, and this program that I graduated from, where I currently teach, Rikkyo University's Graduate School of Journalism, gives PhD degrees in intercultural communication, which sounded interdisciplinary enough that I can combine my journalistic experience with a new one. So right around the time I joined here, I started attending classes at a private interpreting school. I went there for 1 year, and there's no certification system in Japan. So I was given a position as an in-house interpreter for them.
This is conference interpreting.
Conference interpreting, because I still remember I quit the newspaper company I worked for on 31st of August 2011, right after 3/11, the earthquake. And next day, I was in a booth simultaneously interpreting for a UN event, which was taking place in Japan. So my
You must have been very good.
Well, I hope I was. Well,
so were you happy doing that, doing conference interpreting?
Yeah, I was happy to a certain extent, but I didn't want to be just a conference interpreter. Not to say anything bad about conference interpreting. It's just that I had so many things that I still wanted to learn and explore. So it was always a double track. I was doing conference interpreting, but I was also working on my PhD.
Oh, tell us about the PhD.
Yes, so under the supervision of Kayo Takeda, who is now my colleague, I decided to buy my PhD on news translation using a concept borrowed from a renowned researcher under the name Anthony Penn.
But he took it from others.
Well, he gave me lots of, input regarding how I can formulate my own theoretical framework. And so I used risk management as a theoretical framework, and I focused on the translation practices by Japanese newspapers. Yes, so it was basically Obama's speeches translated into Japanese by 6 major Japanese newspapers. I interviewed the generators themselves, borrowing from Luc Vandos there. So these are people who are not trained translators, but they have to translate as part of their job. But they have no guideline, they have no training, they have nothing to rely on. But they translate, and they translate in a very similar way. And I got curious, like, how can it happen?
You mean similar to each other?
Similar to each other. Unlike literary texts, these came out very similar in many cases. For example, maybe you remember when Obama said from Asia to Africa, from the Americas to the Middle East, all 6 papers somehow avoided translating the Americas. But that was the third continent out of the 4. And it was very odd.
Why did they do that?
So why did they do that was my question. And I started asking people, and the answer, tentative answer, or my own answer would be that the Americas is a word that is rarely used in the Japanese context. So the Americas means, North and South American continent altogether, but we don't have a single word for that. We do, but it's too literary. And so therefore, all trained journalists would immediately think, how can I not say this? How can I avoid stating this? But at the same time, it's Obama, US president, making a formal speech. And this meant something, and they were put in quotation marks, indicating that it was a direct quote. And even in Japanese journalism practice, you are not supposed to radically change or omit anything within quotation marks. They are sacred. But this happened in translation. It was just because it was translation that this could happen. So I thought that, okay, had it been the Japanese prime minister saying the exact same thing, would they omit it? And my own answer was no. So I needed a framework to explain this. Why can this happen only in translation? And that is why I used the concept of risk management.
Okay.
There was low risk for them to just skip the Americas in this context.
Well, a slight risk.
Oh, yes.
Some researcher might come along and discover the omission.
Yeah. Well, like me,
Yes,
but they don't
risk,
even consider it a risk at all. I mean, mine's published as a book, and nobody has kind of complained or used it against them. So the thing is that there was such low risk there that the journalists thought that this was okay. Yeah, and which is a sort of justifiable decision making, but nobody really went back to the text and said that, hey, here's an omission, a serious one. If this was done by a professional translator, for example, nobody would say it's okay.
What are you doing now? What are you doing research on now?
So I'm still doing research on news translation, more focusing on the science news because of COVID-19 and other matters happening around Japan. But I am also interested in how machines and humans can coexist as interpreters. And I don't mean in a naive or kind of, we have to defend the industry type of way. I'm interested in how close or how better machines can be in interpretation between Japanese and English. A lot of people say it's almost impossible. But, machine translation has become so good that if there is a possibility of inventing a good enough machine interpretation between Japanese and English, I didn't want to be an outsider. I wanted to be involved.
So you're not worried about job destruction?
Because I can be anything, as I have proven
throughout
my career.
Right.
Sorry, peers, I don't think much of you. Whatever is interesting to me, I am ready to just
Yeah, but if you think about it, machine translation's got better. I mean, Japanese is hard, but the translation industry is still very strong.
Yes.
It's not,
yes.
not cause and effect.
Yeah, the one thing, the one negative impact that we are already seeing is the lack of interest among youngsters in our profession. And we can't help it because people are thinking, oh, that's done by machines. Yeah. I mean, I see no future as a translator, interpreter, and I see that because I teach, these youngsters. And I don't think it's going to be the case, but still they believe that machines are going to take over and do everything that we used to do. And I kind of want to prove them wrong in a realistic way. I don't want to say that, oh, but machines can't do this, or machines will never be able to do that. Of course, there would be parts where only humans can interpret, maybe like silence, for example. But at the same time, machines can do a lot of things that we don't want to do, probably. So I want to coexist, and I am seeking ways to coexist.
So do you think that's what we should be doing research on more at the moment?
That's a good question. To be super honest with you, ever since I finished my PhD, that was in 2016, not long ago, I have always had someone ask me do research on something like, here's a book. Why don't you contribute a
okay.
chapter? Here's a special issue. Why don't you write
It's
this
a social
article?
activity.
Yeah.
You work with people.
I work with people. So the thing is that it's good that I'm taking a year off, doing my sabbatical year in Europe starting next fall, because I didn't really have time to sit down and think, because there was always something interesting enough around me that kept me going. And so maybe it's time that I really sit down and think about it and, really focus on something that I want to do the most.
Excellent.